Kalispera. Good evening. I'm Athanasios Platias. I teach strategy and geopolitics at the University of Piraeus, and I will have the privilege tonight to coordinate a panel with 3 top experts to talk about American and Chinese geopolitical tensions and relations. Let me introduce our speakers. Professor Xuetong from China. He's a professor of international relations at Tsinghua University. He has really branded the Chinese school of realism, moral realism, and he's also secretary of the World Peace Forum. Ambassador General Karl Eikenberry has been an American general, a decorated American general, ambassador in a difficult place, Afghanistan. And since his retirement from diplomacy, he has been involved in teaching in famous universities like Stanford, and he's currently teaching at the Schwarzman College at Tsinghua University. And last but not least, Tom Christensen. Tom is a professor of public policy and international affairs at Columbia University and director of the China and the World program at the same university. He held a political appointment at the George W. Bush administration, being Deputy Assistant Secretary with responsibility of Asian and Pacific affairs. So he's a complete insider, but also an academic. All of them, including the 2 American scholars, are fluent in Chinese, and all of them have written extensively on US-Chinese relations. So we are going to hear from the horse's mouth. I will try to provoke them with questions, and as an introduction, the only thing that I can say is China and the US, both of them, control about 43% of the world wealth. They are the Goliaths, 2 colossus, which are competing. And actually, the 2 of them, they control the majority of the defense spending in the international system. So, moving from cooperation to competition has created tension in the international system that touches everybody and multiple fronts. We live in a period of multi-crisis, and to a large extent, this competition is responsible. So let me try to get really into the heart of the competition, and I will start with Tom. I mean, the world order that we had in the last, let's say, 40, 50 years worked for both of them. I mean, both China and the US became powerful, giants. They created wealth. So globalization and their 40 years of cooperation, it worked for them. So what's the reason that this cooperation is declining, and now we have turned into a competition, which actually may turn that both countries get worse off? So what's the causes of the competition?
Thanks, Athanasios, and to the organizers for having me. It's a great pleasure to be on a panel with my old friends Xuetong and Karl Eikenberry, discuss these issues. I'm obliged to say at the beginning that since I hold a formal advisory position in the US State Department, that everything I say is my own opinion and doesn't necessarily represent that of the US government, so that's out of the way. And I agree with your basic question that both countries have benefited greatly from the existing international order, which was really created at the end of World War II. And here I mean a network of multilateral economic, security, and development organizations. The order has produced a high degree of economic linkage between countries and a transnational production chain. That transnational production chain has produced economic wealth in various regions of the world. It has reduced global poverty. And it has also, and I think this is underappreciated, been a major source for peace in places like East Asia, where we haven't seen an interstate war since 1979. And that's really extraordinary if you know all of the factors for conflict, all the unsettled legacies of history, the different political regimes, and the outstanding sovereignty disputes in the region. It's also provable that it's a major source for peace because where there is this transnational production chain, where there is high degrees of interdependence, those are the regions with the least conflict. And the aggressors recently in international politics have all been countries that are not linked to the transnational production chain. So I think it's a demonstrable fact. I don't think either the United States or China has an alternative blueprint in mind to replace the existing international order as we know it. But both China and the United States have done severe damage to that international order in the last 10, 15 years. And I think that's bad for both countries, and I'll explain what I think has been happening. The United States has been unilaterally violating its commitments to the World Trade Organization in particular by sweeping unilateral tariffs against its economic partners, not only by those tariffs and the violations of the agreements, but also by depriving the organization of adjudicating judges on which the organization really depends. And the United States has pulled out of a bunch of existing multilateral agreements that it helped form. The Trans-Pacific Partnership, the Iran nuclear deal, the JCPOA, and has been absent in the negotiation of other international agreements like the RCEP agreement in Asia. For its part, I think China has done even more damage to the international order as we know it. And again, I believe China has benefited from that order. It has violated the spirit of some of the institutions that are out there, and it has violated the letter of other institutions. So in terms of economics, China's government subsidies and closing of its market to foreign competition in big sectors is a clear violation of the spirit of the WTO, even if it isn't a violation of the letter of the law in every case. And then there are other places where I believe China has violated the letter of the law. In the South China Sea in particular in China's relations with the Philippines, I believe China's behavior is illegal by the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. China's remained outside of important international organizations where its participation would be crucially important. And here I'm thinking of the Paris Club, which deals with distressed debt in the developing world. China is a major lender to the developing world, but it is outside that organization and tends not to coordinate with those organizations. And this is going to become a bigger problem in the next 2 or 3 years as more and more countries get into debt distress. Again, I don't believe China has an alternative order in mind, but I think it's doing damage to the existing order from which, as you suggest in your question, we have all benefited, including the United States and China. What I want to close with is one of my major concerns is that because China has been linked to the transnational production chain, I believe it has been relatively restrained with its growing power in comparison to some other countries. It has been assertive, it has caused destabilization in various places, but it has been relatively restrained compared to some other actors in the international stage. Unfortunately, China is a partner of those other actors, a close partner of those other actors who are not linked to the transnational production chain. And I'm thinking of Russia, Iran, and North Korea. And where China, I think, has done the most damage to the international order is in enabling and defending its authoritarian partners in Russia, Iran, and North Korea when they take actions that really destabilize the international order as we know it. I also believe, as I suggested earlier, that China should coordinate with and maybe even join the Paris Club as we deal with the challenges of debt in the developing world. The United States, I wish it would embrace multilateralism again. It'd be a relatively cheap way to improve the U.S. reputation in international politics. And I know the international institutions that we have are not fully suitable for the 21st century that we live in, but that means they need to be reformed, not torn down and scrapped. I'm a bit of a dinosaur on this in my own country, but I really believe that those institutions have benefited the United States, and there's really not much appetite for supporting them. And China needs to rethink the really damaging impact that its statist subsidies to state-owned enterprises have done to its standing, not only with the United States, but with lots of regional partners in East Asia, with Korea, with Japan. All of them are viewing China with a more jaded outlook because they don't feel that China is providing the same environment for fair competition and market access. And then the last thing, as it follows from my presentation, I really think China needs to rethink the value of its relationship with those extremely revisionist, destabilizing actors that are much more aggressive than the PRC on the international stage. But when China backfills sanctions to Russia, when China refuses to use the word Hamas in descriptions of what happened on October 7th of last year to Israel, when China stops pressuring both North Korea and Russia for arms deals that are clearly in violation of UN resolutions, I think China hurts the international space, but I also believe China hurts itself. I think it harms its own diplomatic portfolio in ways that are not in China's own national interest. So I hope that those changes could be made, but those would be my prescriptions for the problems that I see. But the problems are real, and I'm not entirely unrealistic about how quickly they can be solved. So.
Well, Tom, you're really a dinosaur, because if we look at the debate in the United States, and actually both parties, they are moving in the opposite direction of multilateralism that you're suggesting. So US is changing as well. Let me come now to Professor Yan. The way that I see the competition, and we discussed already some of the causes of the competition, it reminds me of the old Cold War. And let me explain why. We have two coalitions, one oceanic coalition headed by the United States and one continental coalition headed by China, which includes Russia. And they are competing. They are competing at all levels, geopolitically, economically, technologically, and ideologically. The democracies versus authoritarianism. It's the ideological part. Some, they go even further to argue that they are actually in war right now, and they are in war by proxy. The Americans are supporting the Ukrainians, and the Chinese, you are supporting the Russians. So we already have another element of the Cold War, proxy wars. So to my mind, it's clearly that we are back in the Cold War, and actually in a most dangerous Cold War. I know you disagree with this analysis. You believe that we are not in a Cold War. Could you persuade our audience why you are not in the Cold War when we see all these things happening?
Thank you. Thank you very much for the Professor Platias' invitation and taking me here. I think this is a very valuable opportunity and to share my view with this distinguished guest about the global order and China-US relations. Now today we can see not very many people have interest about China-US relations. You see very few audience here, right? From my understanding—
Well, it's almost a full room.
From my understanding, and I already listened to several panels and yesterday and today, I noticed that in Europe, and they do not have that much interest in China-US relations, and they don't think China and the US have the capability to shape the global order. So when we're talking about the global order, and then I guess, or my feeling tells me, and the Europeans believe the world order is shaped not by China and the US. The competition between China and the US is not that important. It has a limited impact on the global order. So most people, at least what I heard, and from the panelists, they believe the world order is shaped by Russia and Europe and the US. And because they think, now look at the war is there in Ukraine, so this proxy war exactly the same like what we experienced during the Cold War, right? So you see the competition between US and Russia and the conflicts between Russia and the NATO, exactly the same like what we experienced during the Cold War. So for many people here, and I do not mean in this room, I mean people to the Delphi forum, and they believe we are already in the Cold War. So actually, I want to share with you my different view about the definition about the global order. Nowadays, and I have a question here for all of you, and is the order in the Europe a regional one or global one? Does the regional order in Europe represent the whole world? And I doubt the Africans will believe the Cold War in the Africa. I don't think the people in Latin America believe now we're in the Cold War. And even to the East Asia, I doubt there will be Cold War, because since 1991, after the Cold War, there's no any war in that region. Even there's no small war like the war in Kosovo or the war in the Chechnya, and such small war didn't happen since 1991. So that's why I think that, and the global order are different from the regional order. And global order is more general, and it concerns the whole global system instead of a regional situation. The second point is that the global order, and actually the global order is decided by three elements. First is the norms. Second is the values. And the third is the power distribution. Now look, if we compare today's order, the global order, with the Cold War, and you find that, hey, during the Cold War, the power distribution is mainly between the two camps, East and West. And today, we don't have that kind of situation. Many people regard it multipolar system, right? No longer bipolar. Actually, for me, I think now it's already bipolar, but different type of bipolar. There's a bipolar between China and the US instead of bipolar between the East and the West. Second, if you compare the norms, now the norms is mainly, at this moment, we're still in the trend of counter-globalization. That's very different. And the Cold War is before the globalization. Now then we have the globalization. Now it's a counter-globalization. We see a lot of decouplings and even the violation of human rights. And Tom said that, and seems that both China and the US do not adhere to international norms like what they did during the post-Cold War period. But then I think the people in this forum do not believe America have the capability and the will to shape the world order in direction of the liberalism. That means that America do not have the will and the capability to resume globalization. They have no will to resume that liberal order. Look at what the US Biden administration did at the Gaza war. They sent weapons there and to support Israel's policy to killing the women and children. And even the White House staff came out to protest their boss. So you find that's why that's my belief is that the people in the Europe don't think U.S. have the will to resume labor order. And so labor order is a typical title for the order during the Cold War. The third element is about the values. So what is the dominant values now? I heard that a lot of people say, oh, the war in Ukraine is for what? For fight for values. And this morning we heard people from the UK say that we fight the war for values. For what values? For human rights? Hey, what's your stance about this war in Gaza? Do you really want to fight for values, human rights? You say, well, we really want to fight for the sovereignty. Well, that sovereignty norm established after the Second World War. It's not after the Cold War, from 1945. And this value actually violated many times since 1945, including the period after 1991, I mean during the Cold War period, only because, and when this kind of violation of the sovereignty or territorial sovereignty in some other countries, not in European countries, people care very little. But when these things happen to some friendly countries, and people say, hey, well, this is a big issue. And so from my understanding now, both norms or the value of the sovereignty, territorial sovereignty, and human rights are being violated. And the situation is getting worse and worse. And the major powers seem to me all take double standard policy. They don't really serious to protect these kind of norms. Okay, I think my time is over. I just want to wrap up. So now from my understanding, and the global order is no longer and shaped by United States itself. US no longer have that capability and will to shape global order like what they did during the post-Cold War period. Thank you.
Well, I found very interesting to hear from you that the world is bipolar. The official Chinese narrative is that we live in a multipolar war. The same thing the Russians say, and actually the Europeans, because they believe that they are also a pole in the international system. Anyhow, so it's interesting to note that. Let me now go to Karl. Karl, East Asia is really the engine, the economic engine of the planet. Also, it's a place that concentrates a lot of people, so demographically it's exploding. And China is next door and tries to become a regional power. And in order to become a global power, first to become a regional power. So the dynamic there is China trying to dominate East Asia as a stepping stone to become a global power. And what are the dynamics there? I mean, if you take one action, there is counteraction, there is balancing coalitions. China is complaining that the others are containing it. So what's the dynamics in East Asia?
Well, first, I wanted to thank the Delphi Economic Forum. It's a dream come true for me to come to Delphi. My new friend, Professor Platias, who said that if I get up every morning and just suck in the air here, I'll leave strategically wiser. And then showing my age here, 4 decades of friendship with Xuetong and with Tom Christensen. So thank you very much. And Xuetong, one other point too, you talked about the audience. We don't have a packed house. I come from a military background. Quality is more important than quantity. So if I could then, as a segue to that, my comparative advantage, as we talked about, is probably in defense and military. So let me focus on that. 4 points to then draw upon. You came to talk about East Asia as you introduced me. So 2 points about East Asia, then 2 points globally. So this session is about U.S. and China and global order, but I would start with East Asia. Point number 1 is that for China and for the United States, it's still the center of gravity, economically and security, is East Asia, or Asia broader. So if we look now at GDP forecast globally for the year 2030, we've got about 6% of it in Asia. We've got about 14% of it in Europe. If we look at research and development around the world, we've got now about 38% in Asia. We've got 28% in the United States. We have 22% in Europe. If we talk about the global semiconductor industry, 75% of it is in Asia. If we talk about the top 10 defense globally, the top 10 largest defense budgets in the world, number 1, 2, 3, 4, and 9 and 10 are in Asia or a country that has a large military presence in Asia. And finally, if we look at 5 of the hotspots in the world that we really worry about, we have Taiwan, we have the East China Sea, we have the South China Sea, we have the Korean Peninsula, we have the Sino-Indian frontier. And what is a common thread through all 5 of those. They're all nuclear powers that are engaged in these potential conflicts. So that first point here, when we talk about global order, yes, but still, the real interests that are driving this in terms of economy and especially in security, they're to be found in East Asia, Asia, Western Pacific. Point number 2, now even narrowing the aperture more within Asia and now talking about the Western Pacific. In the security domain, the differences between China and the United States are very difficult to reconcile. So the United States, they see the interest in terms of sustained presence in the region, in terms of freedom of navigation, freedom of commerce, and protection of allied interest. China, on the other hand, as they look at the Western Pacific, understandably, their strategic interest as they look at the Western Pacific and see a line of United States forces and allies that they would say are ring-fencing them, so to speak. But is there a strategic interest in China in asserting a degree of control or at least influence over the Western Pacific? Yes. And then add to that mix that these are sovereignty issues for China or defined as sovereignty issues by China. So Taiwan and the maritime domain. And then you take strategic interest and you mix those with sovereignty, and that can be a very toxic mix if a crisis were to develop. Now, expanding the aperture a bit here and going globally, and Tom and Xuetong, you already talked about this in different ways as we talk about now the competition between the United States and China going global, so to speak. So very different positions on Russia, Ukraine. Xuetong, I would take one point I would make here, though. You're framing this as all United States view. The European view about Russia is also that this is fundamentally a question of UN, a violation of a UN norm here called sovereignty. If we go back in history, we can each go to data points and say we did things differently and we're being hypocritical. I recall in 1968 that one of the largest common nations worldwide that came for the Soviet move into Czechoslovakia actually came out of Beijing. But we won't go back into history. Israel, Hamas, as Tom had pointed out, a different view from you, different views in Africa. The concern being now that as we've talked about decoupling in the economies, I worry about decoupling in terms of global security. And then the fourth and final point, and even going more broadly globally, is with the number of new domains that are appearing with increasing frequency and consequences in the world of international security, to which we have no real agreed upon norms about how to manage these. So we have the world of cyber, we have space, autonomous vehicles, we have AI, we have differences in how we look at national infrastructure. And the challenge that we're facing right now is that as these new technologies emerge, that because we don't have agreed upon norms, the technologies emerge rapidly, and it's very difficult for either side, for any side then, to take these new technologies and to develop them in coherent and understandable ways into their doctrine, into their security doctrine, into their military doctrines. The consequence of that is that it makes deterrence much more difficult. So let me stop with that, and just to get back to the starting point then, my own view is if we're talking about security, we still begin with East Asia, but it's increasingly going global, and then add to this phenomena about emerging technologies that is very much complicating security dialogues between China and the United States and the rest of the world, and then, of course, is worsening the problem we've got of economic decoupling, because with every year that passes, more and more is getting added to the list of that which has national security implications.
Well, let's talk about the risk of global war. And let's come to you, Tom. I read and I follow the debate in Washington. And I see two different arguments, both of them associated with the so-called Thucydides trap. in the first argument of the Thucydides trap narrative is there's a power transition, China is rising, and when it's about to overcome the United States, there is an instability war. That's the Allison thesis. Then I listen to other scholars that they say, well, no, China is declining. China has reached its peak, and it will declining, and will have war because it's declining. And what is really funny is that scholars of the Thucydides trap and the peaking power, they base their analysis on Thucydides. So they read Thucydides in a completely different way, and they come to the conclusion, both of them, that we are going to have a war. So what's your take on this? Is China rising or declining?
Well, Athanasios, I'd say my first reaction is I think they're all misreading Thucydides. But
I completely agree.
In 20 years ago, I published an article called Posing Problems Without Catching Up, in which I argued that the debate in the United States was missing a lot of important trends in China that posed challenges for the United States. And China was modernizing its military in a certain way at that time to challenge a superior US force. And a lot of Americans were paying attention to whether China was closing the gap with the United States overall and overall power, or a more specific question, whether China was developing the capability to invade and conquer Taiwan, mainland China, to invade and conquer Taiwan. And my article said that these were the wrong questions, and I think they're still the wrong questions. I pointed out in the article that China was developing capabilities short of becoming a peer competitor of the United States around the world that posed real challenges to US interests and real challenges to the interests of US allies and partners in East Asia. That has continued for the last 20 years, and China has very significant capacity to put at risk US forward deployed forces, its bases, its allies and partners. And I still don't think China is a global military competitor of the United States, but we have to take that capability seriously. So I would answer both of those people. Yes, China's rise is important. The more capabilities China has, the more it's able to challenge. But even if it peaks and even if it goes down, China will still be strong enough to spoil America's whole day and to destabilize East Asia, which is important not just to the United States, but to the entire world. So I believe that these power shifts are challenging, but I believe that Beijing and Washington can manage those shifts in a way that prevents a catastrophic war. And I believe that the tensions across the Taiwan Strait, the deterrence that is held in the Taiwan Strait, can be maintained if the three actors involved remain moderate. And I would say if you made me guess whether over the next 5 years that would happen, if you made me guess yes or no, I would say it will. It will take a lot of work. It will take wisdom. It will take various adjustments in our policies. But I believe it can be done. It should be done. And if it isn't done, and we have a large war between the US and PRC, I think it will be the result largely of catastrophic diplomatic mistakes that led to war. And that gets me back to my own reading of Thucydides, which is that was a big part of the story.
Well, you may turn out to be an optimist because a lot of people in Washington, generals actually in active duty, they foresee that we're going to have a war in the next 5 years. So that's a narrative. Let me turn to Professor Jan with another take on the Thucydides trap. I mean, the Thucydides trap is really a structural explanation. Changes of power brings war. Is it any role for leadership? I mean, you have written extensively on leadership. Are leaders incapable of intervening? Is it just a structural thing that leads to war, or there is room for prudent leadership?
Oh, well, I think the question is very interesting and also very important because a lot of people believe Thucydides trap since Graham has suggested this idea. Actually, I don't think Graham have given a clear definition what the trap is. It means a war, or means a proxy war, or it means just confrontation or competition. So there's no clear definition. It's good for everyone to define it according to their understanding, so they can be applicable for anything. Actually, from my understanding, and if you read that book, you find why it means a war. At this moment, I don't think there will be a war between the danger of war between China and the US is very urgent or is very possible. I think very slightly. First, the nuclear weapons is still there. And nuclear weapons still can prevent the traditional war, a direct war between major powers. Even today, you have the war in Ukraine, and still NATO said, no matter what you did in the war, but then they said, we didn't send soldiers there. And no country has, we already sent soldiers to that country. Why? Why they try to hide these facts? The reason is that major powers cannot have a direct war. Otherwise, it may escalate to nuclear war. Well, the disaster is not for Europe, not for Ukraine, for Russia, it's for human being. It can eliminate the human being from the earth. So that certainly is good for the environment, right? The environment totally undermined by the human beings. And so the second thing is that, and I also want to remind you of one article I wrote in 2008. And in that article, I apologized for my wrong prediction about the war across the Taiwan Strait. And I tell why I made that mistake. Since then on, I never repeat the same mistake. I continuously tell the people, I think there's a very slight opportunity for have a war there, because both China and US understand how dangerous if China and US fell in the war against each other. So at this moment, from my understanding, no matter what kind of confrontation or conflicts between China and US has already occurred, and both sides reach a kind of agreement, we cannot go to war. Even proxy war is dangerous. So then, just now I mentioned that the long peace in East Asia. And the long peace started from 1991, after the war in the war in Cambodia ended in 1991. And no one to start a war there. So I don't think China won't do that. And also, I think China tried to prevent this kind of thing happen. China wants to protect this durable peace in East Asia.
So rationally, you don't expect escalation. But Karl, what about inadvertent escalation? I mean, Allison's argument was that there are two paths, one to war. One is power transition, and the other is inadvertent escalation. I mean, you know better than me what's going on in South China Sea. Aircraft carriers almost colliding. Every day, dogfights. I can see easily a scenario that a plane goes down, we have a collision, 100 sailors dead, and then the pressure for escalation is here. So although Professor Yan says, doesn't make sense to escalate due to nuclear weapons, I can see a dynamic coming from the field, escalating up to war and maybe nuclear war. What do you think?
Yeah, well, I'm glad Professor Yan had talked about that 2008 article where he apologized for getting it wrong that a war was going to start over the Taiwan Strait. And I hope for all of us that you keep apologizing every year. But to your point, to the question, a couple of points I'd make with regard to the United States and China back to East Asia, that look, very frankly, if we're talking about the so-called Taiwan scenario, that you have a time-distance factor for the United States and for allies. You have an access issue. So as China continues to build its military up, very frankly, it becomes a more difficult military problem for the United States and for Taiwan, for any partners. And then always remembering that it doesn't matter globally how your military is postured. It has to do with at the point of application. So the United States is a global military power. China aspires to get there, but you've got an array of capabilities that if you want to focus them, they provide challenges. That said, that it's clear to all what the military cost would be if there should be a war over the Taiwan Strait. And from a Chinese perspective, and from a U.S. perspective, certainly to take those costs, everyone knowing this would be catastrophic to go down that path. And then for China, you know, China's not Russia. Mr. Putin has one tool in his toolbox. It's called military and military coercion, maybe information warfare. China's set of tools are diverse. You've got economic tools, you do have informational tools, but so why would China then go directly to the military tool when it has a lot of options that are still available to it? To your point about accidents, though, yes, I worry that we're a wake-up call away from a U.S. and Chinese destroyer colliding in the South China Sea. I worry about two aircraft colliding somewhere over the Taiwan Strait. And the results of that kind of accident, it'd be very difficult to control escalation. In the end, we would. We would not go to a all-out conventional fight over an accident. But we've seen the path that both countries have been walking over the past 15 years now. And should we have an accident of this nature in this environment, my fear would be that there'd be now just 3 more years overnight of continued deterioration in the relationship, and we'd have a new low. The final point I'd make about the military, and we talk about, you had asked the question about is the military preparing for a fight in a certain year. The Chinese military, the United States military, they're very professional military forces. And the party gives the PLA orders, I'm sure, and our political authorities give the United States military orders to be prepared for, and that's what they do. Something that's missing right now in the equation is that our militaries, and more importantly, our defense establishments do not engage in regular dialogue. And if I could come back to the point about the complexity of new technologies emerging and how that does complicate then your planning, how that complicates trying to figure out how to apply this doctrinally, that does in turn complicate deterrence, because neither side, if they're not talking and only looking at each other, they're going to be worst casing. And I think the lack of communications that we have right now is worrisome. That said, there have been signs since President Xi Jinping and President Biden met in San Francisco in November of last year to restore that military dialogue.
Tom, do you share the optimism that there are not paths for escalation in Taiwan? I can see 3. I mean, U.S. changing its one China policy, Taiwan goes for independence, or China decides, let's say, in the next 10, 15 years, in order to rejuvenate itself, it has to reunite. I see clearly 3 paths. What do you think? Do you share Jan's optimism?
I think the situation across the Taiwan Strait is very difficult to manage, but I believe it is manageable. And the 3 paths towards conflict that you just listed are sure paths towards conflict. Certainly if the PRC decides that time is up and it wants to force Taiwan into unification against the will of the Taiwan people, that will be a source of a war. I believe that if the United States moves off its very successful traditional policy towards cross-strait relations, which has kept the peace for a very long time, it has been an effective deterrent strategy of maintaining a strong military presence in East Asia, strengthening the Taiwan's native self-defense capabilities, and combining that with a moderate political strategy, the One China policy, which maintains strategic ambiguity. I think that that has been very successful. If America decides one day to change all that and to recognize Taiwan as a sovereign state or restore the alliance with Taiwan, I think that could be a source of conflict for sure. I just hope that people recognize that the system as it stands now is not broken. Taiwan is a miraculous place. It's very successful. Peace has been maintained across the Taiwan Strait since 1958. That is a miraculous outcome. And the problem that I see is that people think the system is somehow broken and needs to be fundamentally changed. And most of those fundamental changes are along the lines of your pathway to conflict. And I hope they aren't adopted, and I wish people would recognize that everyone needs to calm down and try to stabilize the situation across the Taiwan Strait for the benefit of everyone, including the PRC. If the PRC fights a conflict across the Taiwan Strait, it will be devastating for the PRC's foreign relations, it'll be devastating for the PRC's economy, and obviously it will be devastating for Taiwan.
Our time is up, so in this kind of optimistic note, I would like to thank you for the contribution in our understanding in the US-China antagonism. Thank you very much.